So in today's video, I want to get back to the central thesis that we have been discussing here in this series centered around the magic of A Song of Ice and Fire, and that is the idea that there are likely people trapped in the wall, strapped to weirwoods, and having some sort of magic done on them to mind meld them with these weirwoods, and this is somehow leading to the others. I don't have all of the details worked out yet, but it is something similar to what we saw in the television show in Season 8, when the Night's King was bound to a weirwood and turned into another. And this does, on some level, make sense with how George does do some conscious merging sort of stuff. If you could have the spirit of the natural weirwood, which is never dying, and you merge it with a human form, you might create some sort of undying human life force that you can use for shadow binding or blood magic, right? And maybe on some level, if we are trying to figure out the mathematics of the magic behind how all of this works, because magic is really just technology you don't understand, like there are going to be rules that work some way, right? Like we might not get to like the next level of like, well, why are the weirwoods undying? But it's like, okay, we know the weirwoods never die. And so maybe if you merge them with a human form, you get some sort of undying one in the wall that is a source of shadow binding magic, the way that like Stannis' life force is a source that Mel can use to make shadow babies. If you merge people with weirwoods, do you create a super magic power source, right? Especially if you are merging them around this heart tree, this world tree symbolized heart tree at the heart of the wall, which seems to be a giant magic power source, right? That's the idea, is that the wall is in some way a giant magic power source. I think that thesis in some form is a very reasonable explanation for the wall as a magic power source, but also for the wall's physical existence and for what's going on with the others and why the wall may need to come down, and it all works, in my opinion, thematically very well. If George Martin, this progressive author, who is likely to have some progressive themes in his book, has the end game be the wall is the problem and the wall creates the others, that is very good. Like the idea of the wall creating the others makes the wall go up at least a few levels as a thematic device, in my opinion, right? Because he wrote about the wall inspired by Hadrian's Wall. And this is what he said in a Rolling Stone interview when he was asked about it. He said the wall was one of the first things he came up with. He might have even said the first thing he came up with. So like the wall and the idea of the wall is something central to this story. It is one of the central thematic points that George is getting across. And Hadrian's Wall, how he talks about it, he says, we know now there were only Scots beyond the wall, but they didn't know that. They built this wall, and then all of a sudden, there could be any kind of monsters out there because this was the end of the world. So when you build a wall and say, this is the end of the world, you create others who are monsters beyond that wall by building the wall. The wall creates the others, thematically and magically, if our theory is correct. Also, on the topic quickly of George R.R. Martin interviews, he says in the same interview, the idea of being on Hadrian's Wall planted something in him, this barrier against dark forces. That's a little bit of funny wordplay if George knows that the wall was actually a big plant. And you know, it's also a bit of very funny wordplay if this guy, who has been writing this story for decades now, decided at one point he's going to start describing his writing process by saying, I'm a gardener, not an architect. And then it turns out the biggest building and largest structure in his entire world is a big plant. And then when someone asks him about that the first time it's been revealed, after he's being interviewed for the first time, he'll just lean to the camera and go, you know, I always told you I was a gardener, not an architect. And then he'll do his little George laugh. Like, he's been telling that joke to an audience of one for, like, years at this point. Years. And that is an A+ joke. That is such a good joke to have set up for so long, I almost feel bad about even mentioning it, but that is genius. So, like, this theory feels like it works. It feels like it physically explains the wall, even if we do have a little bit of work to do as a community, because I have some absolute scholars down there in the comments. We have a little bit of work to do with what I talked about at the beginning of this video, right? Linking how exactly the others are created, what is George exactly doing magically there. But I think the idea that the wall creates the others, and there are potentially these undying ones as a power source in the wall, that all seems to line up really well. It makes the wall thematically better, in my opinion. It makes the story better, in my opinion. It makes sense of Daenerys' story, in my opinion. I'll do probably a whole video about this, but it really makes a lot of sense of Arya's story. The fact that she is inducted into this group who teaches her about the gift of death and how all men must die and how important that is and how anything else is a corruption of nature, right? Like, everything else is a corruption, and what is the blue heart that the Undying Ones are frozen around in Daenerys' House of the Undying vision? It's a still beating, corrupt blue heart, because the heart tree of the wall is corrupted by this magic that has been done upon it. This very powerful magic done way back in the day when the Children of the Forest were at war with the First Men was very powerful, and it corrupted this world tree, this heart tree organism, and started using it for blood magic. And that was a big problem that our heroes are going to have to solve if they want to fix things in this story. But back to the central theme of the wall creating the others, right? If that is what's actually going on, that makes sense of why, when you have the 5 forts as another end of the world type situation, there are other like beings attacking from beyond the 5 forts, because everyone kind of wonders, like, are there others just like everywhere? There are these like, giant forts and these stories of the long night. It's because magically, essentially, when you do this, when you create these magical wards that you mark as the end of the world, you otherize those beyond. So I would say, honestly, probably, if your question is, do the 5 forts have some others going on beyond their border and something similar like this? Probably. We're never going to get the details of it, but I would say the reason thematically this happens is because the walls create the others. The end of the world, these borders, these barriers that you put up, create others which you tell stories about and turn into monsters. So in George's world, the walls literally make the others. It's great. It's perfect, in my opinion. And something I do want to throw out that I hope to expand upon and give its own video one day, so if you have anything to add to this, please throw it down in the comments. But if the wall creates the others, and we've seen shadow binding and shadowy figures used as a power source, and the others we see in the prologue and the others that the wildlings talk about are reported like shadows, right? They make no sound when they move. It's a shadow emerged from the dark of the wood. They are called white shadows or white walkers at times. These things have been called by George white shadows. So the idea that I've been kicking around in my head that still needs a little bit of work, and maybe some of you in the comments could say something or point to a book quote or passage that would help enlighten me, but one thing I'm working on the idea of is essentially, could at least some of the others, right? Some of the others that we see, perhaps the ones in the prologue, that are described like shadows, right? They make no sound when they move. A shadow emerged from the dark of the wood. Could some of these things be literally like permanent shadow babies by these things that are bound in the wall? So essentially, they are the shadows that are created by this blood magic spell, and they could have been created with the purpose to destroy mankind. So essentially, at least some of the others that we see out there are genuinely shadowy things that are fully intent on destroying mankind. But also, the others are people bound within the wall who are essentially trapped there and need to be given the gift of death, right? They need to be killed. This situation needs to be dealt with somehow. like, it lets George sort of have his cake and eat it too. If somehow there are, like, maybe different ranks of others, or some of them are turned like the Night King is from people, and then some of the things that we see are like the shadows birthed from those things. I don't know for sure, but if someone could help me, someone could enlighten me on anything that might make some sense of that, right? Because the idea of the others that we physically see out there being essentially bound shadows, that is interesting. To me, it makes a lot of sense of a lot of the physical characteristics we seem to get of the others, and the only question that really raises in my mind is like, okay, if those shadows that we see are the source of the physical cold, are the bodies bound in the wall still a physical cold source in this way, or do there have to be shadows bound to the tree as well, perhaps next to the body? I don't know. But the idea that these bodies bound to the weirwoods within the wall and turned could be a magic power source, it could explain, the shadows that we see in the others in the prologue. If those are literal shadows, they could be shadow babies, but permanent because the undying body in the wall is a permanent life force, unlike the temporary spell that Melisandre did. And in the House of the Undying, the same thing. If they somehow shadow bound and created bound shadows out of these figures within the wall, then you could have a magic power source. So if we're talking about thematically, how is George going to make any of this work? I think the idea of the wall creating the others makes the wall work thematically incredibly well. And if the others that are trying to attack and kill humanity are shadows birthed from these people trapped in the wall somehow, and birthed with the intent to destroy humanity, then he gets to have his cake and eat it too, in that, oh yeah, these shadows that are coming and raising the dead and amassing an army need to be defeated, or need to be at least fought against, until you can solve the problem of the others, the undying ones, within the wall. And just fully speculating here, obviously, at this point in the video, but one thing that would thematically also work kind of well, then, is, okay, why did they sign the pact in the first place? Well, if you can create these shadows by binding people to weirwoods, merging their spirits, maybe they need to be green seers, right? Maybe it's like magically gifted people who this needs to be done to, but if you can do that and create this incredibly powerful magic, shadow binding magic, blood magic power source, and create shadows with the intent, maybe the children birth shadows with the intent to destroy humanity, and then maybe the last hero, or someone in humanity discovered how the magic was done, did it for the side of humanity, birthed some shadows with the intent to destroy the children, and suddenly the children and mankind had a mutually assured destruction thing going on, where both of them were doing this weirwood magic, corrupting the weirwoods, and doing blood and shadow magic with them, birthing others with the intent of destruction, and then they came together and realized, oh no, we're both screwed now, mutually assured destruction, let's sign a pact and make sure this doesn't bother us. Let's build a big wall, and we'll grow a line of weirwoods, we'll bind a bunch more shadows to all the weirwoods, we'll build a big wall, and then suddenly both of us are protected by a big ward against all of the weapons that we just created, but if any of us don't follow the pact, mutually assured destruction. So it encourages everyone to follow the pact. The same way that we use nukes and mutually assured destruction to bind pacts together, George could be making a statement as kind of a, hippie from the right time to worry about that. He might be making a statement that, hey, maybe getting past mutually assured destruction as a means to bind society together is a good thing to do. So, all of this thematically just introduces a bunch of interesting endgame stuff to this story that, in my opinion, seems to line up a lot with what George R.R. Martin would write about. That's part of why I like this theory so much. It works physically, it works thematically, it works with visions that we have been given thus far. It makes sense of Daenerys' early game story about the Undying Ones, the crucifixion, the freeing of the slaves, learning about wielding power, overthrowing cultures, trying to understand how to change a culture the correct way and build something new, right? like Bran having to overcome the icy House Stark tradition of the old ways, Daenerys may have to overcome the Targaryen tradition of dragons do not plant trees, and she may need to learn to plant trees. She needs to learn to build something better, as does Bran. The wall and the old ways being the problem, and a different world needing to be built. It just all really lines up, and covering this probably in its own full video later, but it does really make sense of Arya's story as well. Why is she off on the other continent learning about all men must die, how to deliver the gift of death? She has to learn all of this stuff because she needs to go and give the gift of death to at least some of the Undying. So yes, spoilers for a future video, but Arya stabs the Night King might kind of be from George. Like, I bet she gives the gift of death to at least one of the Undying, right? Like, maybe she figures out how to kill these things, these people stuck in the wall, because she has now also been conditioned by her story arc to understand that all men must die. You notice how all of these characters are thematically like, if this is true, all of their lessons are like thematically centering around the idea of killing these Undying ones trapped in the wall as a magical power source that has made things the way they have been in the world for the last thousands of years, right? And maybe her forgetting that she's a Stark is part of training her to do what needs to be done, even though the idea of the wall has essentially been a power source for House Stark, right? The old ways give the Starks magical power. They give them a right to rule the North from Winterfell based on legend and tradition. If she has to forget who she is and do the right thing because all men must die, well, oh shoot, that's all that she's been learning about for the last part of her story arc with the Faceless Men. That's who the Faceless Men maybe want her to kill. Spoilers again for another video. I'm going to give this its whole big discussion that it is worth on its own one day. Hit that subscribe button for that. But yeah, the first people the Faceless Men delivered the gift of death to were slaves who prayed for it. Because why? They were trapped in a horrible life, essentially being used as a power source for Valyria, for the Empire of Valyria. They were essentially the same thing, a magical trapped power source who wanted the gift of death, and that's who the Faceless Men first killed. And by doing so, potentially that could have brought about the doom of Valyria. Who knows? Maybe, like, in the end, like, some loss of slave labor allowed these powerful volcanoes to start to erupt, right? Something. I'm not super well read on the Doom of Valyria currently. I've been down a ice rabbit hole much more so than a fire rabbit hole. I assume you understand. But point being, the Faceless Men teach Arya the story of how they originated, and it was by giving the gift of death to these slaves who were essentially a magical power source for fire. Arya will need to do the same for the magical power source for ice, the Undying ones who are essentially slaves within the wall. Whether your story is revolving around freeing slaves, the gift of death, bringing down the wall, Jon, Dany, Arya, all of them, Bran, everyone is thematically rotating around the black hole that is the giant heart tree at the Night Fort with these Undying ones strapped to it. If this theory is correct, all of these plots and all of these thematic lessons are orbiting it, just waiting for George to pull it back in when they restore the Night Fort in the Winds of Winter. It really is starting to feel like that is the only place this can be going to me. And so far, it seems like you in the comments have been mostly in agreement. So thank you all very much for watching. Thank you for all the support so far. For everyone who has subscribed, it has been great to see you all join up. We have some absolute scholars down in the comments who are throwing out a ton of helpful information that helps me process these ideas, the peer review process of A Song of Ice and Fire theories, if you will, and we are building a very good community for that, so I'm very excited to continue to explore these books with you in future videos. With that being said, I think that pretty much wraps up my current thoughts on how the endgame themes of all of this work. Like I said, some interesting little links that we still need to draw in how maybe the creation of the others works magically, but I think thematically, a lot of this seems to be where George is going with things. Let me know what you think of that idea down in the comments, and I'll be back with something else very soon.